this. Zelensky's celebrated as a hero in the liberal press. I'm curious what your thoughts are on him and how he has handled this situation, or if he's really had any control over the situation at all.
Well, before we talk about the comedian drag queen who's now become president of Ukraine, which is a story for the ages, frankly. I mean, Hollywood couldn't make this stuff up. It's unbelievable. We ought to stop and go back to Schultz, because Schultz is a tragic figure in my judgment. Because in many ways, when he speaks, he's speaking for most Europeans. And the Europeans haven't figured out that this is driven largely from Washington, what's going on in Ukraine. We've been pushing this envelope for a long time, and it's not in Europe's interest. European interests have not figured prominently in our calculus. All we've done is look carefully at what damage we could do to Russia. Now, that did not happen with President Trump. There were people in his administration, like Pompeo and others, who were very much committed to the same things as Blinken and company. That's a whole nother story. But I can tell you from personal experience with President Trump, he was hard over in his opposition to war, period. He thought that was the dumbest thing that we could possibly do. And unless somebody attacked us directly, he wasn't interested in it. And he particularly saw Russia in a different light, as a potential, not necessarily ally, but certainly as a partner under the right circumstances. Saw no reason for violence or hostility towards Russia. And that was helpful, but unfortunately it was a brief pause. And the underlying drift in the direction of hostility and confrontation continued. And I think now the danger is, the longer this lasts, the greater the possibility is that something terrible will happen to us. And the Europeans, I think, are beginning to figure this out, because this existential issue for Russia in Ukraine becomes more existential every time we involve ourselves with Zelensky, send him more equipment, more support, and urge him to stonewall and fight it out. And the question is, how long do the Russians go before they finally present us with an ultimatum or potentially strike back at us? I don't know. That's why proxy wars are so dangerous, because the proxy is not under control. Who is controlling Zelensky? Do we really control him? Are there other people in Ukraine controlling him? I've had people tell me that there's very little he can do, because if he does anything his backers don't like, he'll be stood up against the wall and shot. I mean, he's got Ukrainians that are very radicalized. And we've seen plenty of evidence for that in this place called Mariupol and elsewhere, where they have shot people that refused to fight, where they wouldn't let civilians leave areas, because they knew that if they let the civilians leave, that the Russians then would take the gloves off and come in after them. You know, we've been listening over and over and over, well, the Russians hit these buildings and hit this hospital and so forth. Well, if you put your artillery in the hospital, chances are it's going to become a legitimate target. Same thing's true in these urban areas where they've had ambushes and killed Russian troops that came in there initially not firing, then had to fall back and then turn those buildings to the extent they could, isolate the enemy and take them under fire. So all of this begins to build, and eventually there's a meeting in the Kremlin with the general staff and with Mr. Putin, and they say, how much longer do we put up with this? Do we utterly level the entire border with Poland to make it clear that we'd rather have a desert there than allow anything else to come in from Poland? And how close does that bring us to conflict, direct conflict with Russia? And how rapidly will that escalate to the nuclear level? I don't know. I'd like it to stop. So you're asking all the right questions. None of us really knows those answers unless they're on the inside. And the people on the inside in this administration aren't really telling us the truth about much of anything.
Exactly. You mentioned the fact that earlier on you said that there's no chance that Russia essentially doesn't come out victorious over Ukraine if it's, you know, the two parties that continue to fight and that's it. Given that, and given the fact that what we seem to be witnessing from the Russian military, again, we don't have the Russian playbook before us right now, we're just speculating, but it seems as though the Russian military has just been applying enough pressure to keep massive troops protecting Kiev, Ukrainian troops protecting Kiev, while the Russian military fulfills their goals in the outskirts of Ukraine, doing their denazification, demilitarization, removing NATO weaponry, these sorts of things. I'm curious then, given today's events, an alleged massacre, 410 civilians they're reporting, at least, is said they're said to be dead in the city of Bucha in Ukraine.
Bucha, yeah.
Yeah. So, what do you think about this? Do you think it would make sense for the Russian military, who spent a month occupying that city, living, in relative peace with the civilians there, to kill 410 civilians on the last day as they leave the city? Or do you think that there might be some questions that should be raised about this?
Well, no, I don't. And I think experience in military affairs suggests that if you do that sort of thing, all you do is stiffen resistance against you.
Mm-hmm.
The bodies don't disappear. The act persists. It has a bad odor. It doesn't go away. And it's hard for me to believe that this was a deliberate act by the Russian military. That said, it's not impossible. We did things in Vietnam that were terrible. We know about some of them. We don't know about all of them. Soldiers on the battlefield, if they're frustrated and angry, if they're drinking a lot of alcohol, using drugs, any number of things, they can suddenly run amok and do terrible things.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I looked at both sides of this, and I couldn't come away with a certain conclusion one way or the other. There were things that didn't make a lot of sense. A lot of these people had this white armband tied around them. The white armband was a signal to the Russian army that, look, I'm not part of the Ukrainian army. I don't support it. Effectively, I'm not in the war. And all of a sudden, large numbers of those people are dead. We do know that Ukrainian forces have killed people like that elsewhere. They've assassinated mayors, people have disappeared, and so forth. But again, I'm not saying that happened. I don't know. And my experience in the Balkans, when I was involved with the air campaign, and then earlier in Bosnia in '95, the Finns were a very good source of investigative scientists, medical people. They would get in and they could tell you the truth. And what the Finns told you, you could believe. But the two sides involved rarely. And I'm not putting much trust in what either side says right now in Ukraine. I was looking at all the figures that are being supplied to people about all the equipment that supposedly the Ukrainians have destroyed. It sort of reminded me of the last election, when more people voted than are registered to vote in the United States. I mean, if you believe all of these figures, I think you wiped out a substantial portion of both armies in terms of the figures. I don't buy it. I'm just very skeptical of all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, you have masses of troops surrounding this Ukrainian mass that remains in southern Ukraine. How will that turn out? I don't know, but I would suspect that the Russians can probably annihilate it. How they will do it is it's up to them. In 1944, when the Russians cut off and surrounded 50,000 German troops in what we today call White Russia near Minsk, they backed off, they surrounded it, and they brought in air power, 5,000 aircraft. And most of the German troops in the field could not break out because they were surrounded by armor, and they were killed. I guess we could see something like that happen. The Russians can do it, and now they have much more accurate munitions in many cases that they haven't used a lot of, but they could use down in southern Ukraine. I don't know. I think we're going to have to wait for events to dictate the outcome. But I really think this war will end when Putin decides to end it, not at any other point in time. And right now, he sees no reason to end it, given the attitude that he's encountered at the negotiating table.